You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. This coming week, leaders from around the North Atlantic Treaty Organization will convene on Washington, D.C. for NATO's annual summit. A few weeks ago, I recorded a conversation with Admiral Rob Bauer of the Royal Netherlands Navy. He is the chair of NATO's Military Committee, and in that capacity, he is the senior-most military officer in NATO. Enjoy the conversation. So why did you join the Navy?
Not entirely by accident, but I didn't know what I wanted to do when I was 17, 1 year before I finished high school. And so I started to think about it. And one of the studies I was looking to was economics, and the other one was a technical study. And then a friend of my father came for a weekend and he said, "Why don't you go to the Navy?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know, sir." So he gave me a folder and I applied for all the tests that you had to do, physical tests and psychological tests. And it was like a whole program, 3-4 times. You had to go there for 2 days throughout the year. And I still didn't know. So I basically passed all the tests and I thought, 2 of the 3 will say, "You're not welcome." And I'm going to do the third one. And then all 3 in the end said, "You're welcome." And then I thought, okay, now I have to make a decision. And the reason why I went to the Navy was because the studies was not just studies. It was 3-year studies and then 1.5 years of practical internship and then study again. And I thought that's something I like more than just studying for 6 years.
And this was right at the beginning of the 80s, is that right?
Yes. 81, I joined the Navy. And then I became an officer in 84, did this practical period, and then another 2 years of studies.
What'd they have you doing at first? Were you on a ship or what were you doing?
So the first was 3 years in the Naval Academy. Then I became an officer and joined a ship that went to the Caribbean for 7 months.
That's right. You guys have all those cool islands down there still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bonaire, Curacao, Aruba. In the south and in the north, you have Statia, Saba, and St. Martin.
And what was your first job on that ship?
I was a watchkeeping officer, as they say. And you basically learn how to navigate a ship, maneuver a ship, and basically sail it safely. And then later in your career, you go and learn about how to fight with the weapons on board. And then you become a weapons officer and you become part of the war fighting more. But in the beginning, it's about sailing the ship safely.
On that first tour, did you ever have any doubts about your decision to join?
No, actually not. I mean, it depends a little bit on the crew you're with, the people around you, whether it is fun or not. So the first ship was great fun. But I had a ship later on, a couple of years later, where there were not a lot of people that I liked. I liked the job, but then it can be a little bit more lonely because you are on a ship and you're 6 months away. And then if there's not a lot of people that you really have a connection with, I mean, you don't need to have a connection with all 180, but you need 1 or 2 for a period like that. And that was not the case there. So then it is a little bit more difficult.
How often in your career did you end up on tours out to the Caribbean?
3 times. And then 2 long trips to the Far East. One with destination Australia for the bicentennial in 1988. And then another trip to Japan in 2000. 400 years diplomatic relationships between Japan and the Netherlands. So those were 2 long trips to the Far East. Yeah.
And throughout your career, you've seen almost sort of a full circles. When you joined the Navy, of course, the main threat was the Soviet Union, the main threat to Europe. And then, of course, the Soviet Union fell apart. We had a period of relative peace. The focus then for Europe was a whole bunch of different things, but were sort of lesser included cases, much less threatening to Europe itself. And now again, Russia. You must reflect on this all the time, especially given the job you have now. But when you talk to young sailors who are joining now, who sort of are joining at the point that you joined, where the Soviet Union still seemed quite fearsome in the early 80s, what do you hear from them?
I think it's a bit of a mix. I think as I joined, I didn't join to fight Russia or something. That was not in the front of my mind. It was more like I want to see the world. The adventure sort of was appealing. And that was true. I mean, very interesting trips to faraway countries. But over time, you became, of course, more and more part of this, the operations and what it meant. We were at sea during Christmas or, New Year's Eve. We were at sea waiting for a Russian ship to come out of the Baltic Sea and then escorted through the North Sea when that ship was on its way to the Mediterranean. So, or in the high north, ships would come over the high north into the Atlantic Ocean. Those were missions and tasks. That was the normal thing. And I think it's a little bit more mixed now. There's still the work in the Caribbean. There's still, for a while, we had the counter-piracy missions off the coast of Somalia. So it is a mix of things, but we have now much lower numbers of frigates. So the ability of a ship or a group of ships to make a longer trip for diplomatic purposes has come down because the navies are much smaller. So you need the ships closer at home to do the things that are necessary. Yeah.
Who was the best boss you had before you became a flag officer?
I think it was a 3-star admiral. I got a phone call and I was a lieutenant, which is, let's say, a captain in the Army. And the appointer of the HR division said, you're going to have an interview with this 3-star admiral because he needs an ADC, an aide de camp. I said, I don't want that job. I don't care. He said, you're going to have a job interview with him. So I come in there and so he says, what do you say? I said, I'm a navigation officer. I'm a warfare officer. And now I'm supposed to wear your suitcase and I don't think I'm suitable. I'm not the right person for that job, sir. So he laughed and he looked at me and he said, that was exactly what I thought until I became an admiral. So he started to explain what the job was about. And that caught my attention. And in the end, he said, you have to tell me. If you don't want the job, you're no use to me. So tell me. I said, okay, sir, I apply. I was one of 3 candidates. And then I got the job. And 3 months later or something, I was on a trip with him. And I said, sir, why did you actually choose me? And he said, you were the only one that didn't want the job. And that was a good lesson. But he was basically the guy. He and I had a very similar caricature. He was making fun of people. He had a face that if he looked at you, you were thinking, my God, this is going wrong. But you had to look at his eyes, and then you knew he was playing a trick with you. And I knew that when that was. So he would sort of arrive in the morning at a very early visit. He would say, oh my God, my ADC again got me out of bed too early. And he was grumpy and he needed coffee and he needed a smoke. And people thought, my God, the poor man looking at me. But I knew he was making fun. So yeah, he was a good boss.
What was the job you had before you became Chief of Defense Staff?
I was the Vice Chief of Defense. So I was the number 2. I did that for 2 years. And before that, I was the Director of Plans, which was the director under the Chief of Defense who is looking at the long-term investments, technology, innovation, in what sort of capability should we invest for the future.
Is that how it typically works there? Is that the typical career path at that level, or is it contingent on?
No. It was interesting. The former Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S., Joe Dunford, I talked to him about this. So can you actually sort of predict who is going to be a 4-star? And he said, we did a study on that. So he had given the files of a number of 4-stars to the Defense University in Washington, and then said, look for if you can find things that are typical for this career. It's a lot of operational jobs. It's a lot of Pentagon jobs. What is it? In the end, they didn't find any typical career moments, or if you have done this, then you will become. So it has to do with the time where you were chosen, because sometimes you need a different type of leader given the circumstances, and then they pick out someone who might be unexpected if you look at his or her career.
By the time you became Chief of Defense Staff, you were already a seasoned leader. What are some things about your time in that role that surprised you, that you're like, wow, I didn't expect to be having to deal with this, or was there anything like that?
Having been the Vice Chief of Defense, I thought I sort of was very well prepared, which was true when it came to content. All the topics I knew about, so I didn't have to worry about those. All the topics in terms of in the defense staff and all the dossiers that were connected to the job, I knew them. So that was a great relief in a way. But the way the so-called game is played was completely different. When it comes to it, people want to talk to the boss, not the deputy. So if the boss is not able to come, you are graciously received as the deputy. But there is always a difference between how they talk to you and how they talk to the boss. So if it becomes really, really important, they want to talk to the boss. That was one thing that in the end, you are number 1. There's no one standing behind you to give you advice in the same sense as you had ever before in your career. What you say is in the end, that decision is the decision. And it sometimes makes you lonely because it is, your generals and admirals that you command think you talk too much to the politicians. And the politicians think you talk too much to the generals and the admirals, and you are the only one that has to find the right balance.
And everyone probably thinks you talk to the press more than you actually do.
Well, that's more a problem of the politicians. They often think the military talk too much to the press. But the interesting thing now is I am the boss of no one in this job, but I have no boss either, other than the combined chiefs of defense who elected me for this position. But the Secretary General of NATO is not my boss in the sense he cannot fire me because I was elected by the chiefs of defense.
Let's dig into that. First, how did you even get put forward for this job in the first place? How does it work? Because I think when most people think about NATO, they think about SACEUR and they think about the Secretary General, but you have quite an important role. And let's shine a light on, first, through your own experience of being put forward for that role, because you would have dealt with your predecessor when you were CDS. So how did this all come together?
Yeah, so the chair of the military committee is elected amongst the chiefs of defense. So it starts with, at some stage, there is going to be an election. And then amongst the chiefs of defense, there is a discussion. It starts with yourself. Would I like that job? Would I like that position to take? And then you need the support of your country, because it is your country that pays for most of the costs that are connected to this job. Because I work for NATO, but all the costs fall to the Netherlands.
Costs for things like what?
Costs for my security close protection detail. Costs of finding a residence. Costs of bringing the additional personnel. You bring about 5-6 people to the CMC team as part of your... So the nation that brings the CMC has to bring those 5-6 additional people as well. Costs for travel, costs for all the things that are connected to it. On top of the salaries is the allowances when you're abroad, things like that. That's all for the nation.
You have to want it and they have to want you to have it.
Yes. So you need the support, because it is one of those jobs where because it's not a position of power, it's a position of influence. So you will gain influence over time if you do things well. If you're successful after a couple of years, then you sort of gain influence over time, because people sort of politely will talk to you the first time because you're the chair of the military committee, because you're the highest military person in the alliance. But if you don't add value to the people you talk to, why should they talk to you again? So in the first, let's say 1.5, almost 2 years, I found out you have to invest a lot in people. And if they ask you to come back and to talk to you again, then you gain influence, because why would you ask to talk to me again if you don't want to hear what I say? And so if you start to believe that I add value to you, then you talk to me again. And then I gain influence. And that's basically what I try to do. And the fact that the chiefs of defense asked me to stay longer is probably a bit of evidence that they think I add value to them.
It's been since 2021, is that right?
It's been since June 2021.
And you have another, so till January next year.
Mid-January 2025, it's over.
You know, so you started obviously a year before Russia reinvaded Ukraine.
A little bit less than a year.
Yeah, a little bit less than a year.
It was interesting because I joined in June 2021. President Macron talked about NATO being brain dead. And 2 months later, we had to leave Afghanistan in a rush. So after those first 2 months, I thought this is going to be 3 very long years, because we're going to talk for the next 3 years about the lessons learned of Afghanistan. So the start was in a time frame where NATO not necessarily was seen as a very positive, credible, strong organization.
So you worried it would just be licking our wounds the entire time, sort of, yeah.
Yeah, in a way, I was sort of thinking about it like, wow, this is going to be a challenge. How am I going to help change that?
You mentioned, you don't step into the role with a lot of influence. You have to sort of earn that. You stepped into the role, the way I would characterize it, is our catastrophic end to a catastrophic mission in Afghanistan happens. What role were you playing from the outset? How were you keeping busy? What were you doing that summer through the evacuation and shortly thereafter?
If I look back, there's a lot of things that happen as a result of all the things that there's a whole machinery in the NATO headquarters that is sort of working on finding an agreement on things and working on texts and changing words and talking, discussing. So there's a lot of things that you not necessarily directly influence on a daily basis. Of course, in the meetings in the military committee with the military representatives of the chiefs of defense, there you have a direct influence as the chair of that meeting. So we had a meeting on getting out what they called the NATO affiliated Afghans. Those were people that worked for NATO over the 20 years NATO was there. And how were we going to get those people out if they wanted out? And then I remember there was a discussion where some nations said, well, I don't know how much it will cost. I don't know how long this will take. And then I found myself becoming more and more irritated. And I said, we can talk about doing things right, but I think this is the moment we need to do the right thing. And everybody looked at me and it was complete silence. And I think everybody understood, this is not about procedure. This is about, because I said, if we wait another 2 weeks, those people are dead.
Very important part about leadership is setting the tone in the right moments.
Yeah, that's what you try to do. And I'm not necessarily convinced I've always been successful, but there's a number of moments which you remember where you sort of think, I might have made the difference there because you are not the boss of the nations. You're not the boss of those military representatives. You can only convince them by using the right arguments.
Fast forward to once it was very clear that Russia was actually planning to invade. Take me inside your office, inside the committee that you chair. What was that like? What were you doing? What were you trying to accomplish?
So for me, the Ukraine, let's say, building crisis started in the spring. Just before I arrived in the NATO headquarters, the Russians had built up forces in Russia along the eastern border for an exercise. And then that was in the spring of 21. And then they said, we're going to leave. But they left certain things behind. So that in itself was a bit suspicious, but nobody understood what it would mean. And then in October 2021, 2 months after the departure from Afghanistan, I remember that the then Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Walters, came to me and said, Rob, I think we have a problem because we see the buildup of forces and we believe the Russians are going to invade Ukraine. And I said, if you think that this remark is going to involve NATO, that's not how it works. If the US knows a lot, you probably have to share more because to convince other allies.
Yeah, a lot of European countries were still not convinced.
No. So then the US has done a remarkable thing, and they have shared intelligence at a scale that was not seen before. And so more and more, we sat down together in the military committee, but also in the North Atlantic Council, talking about this intelligence picture. And we basically saw from November till the invasion and thereafter, the buildup of the forces. We saw more and more brigades come. We saw the hospitals come. We saw the ammunition come. We saw the blood come. And if the blood comes, within 10 days, the war will start. So basically, on the 23rd, I said to the team, go home because tonight we'll get the phone call. And we knew within a window of 3 hours when the invasion was going to start. So I remember looking at the map and, my God, this is going to happen. And there were still a number of nations that said, we see all that, we see it, we acknowledge it, but we cannot believe he will do it. Now, the fact that we had been talking about it for 4.5 months and sharing this and the buildup of everything we knew, not only in Russia, but also in Belarus, meant when the Russians invaded Ukraine, the full-fledged invasion, that within an hour we had an agreement on the response from the alliance. Because the nations that couldn't believe it flipped over and said, yeah, we were wrong. We need to take measures now.
How often do you convene your organization for the meetings that you chair?
So we have normally twice a week. We have the military representatives around the table. Then 3 times a year with the chiefs of defense, their boss. And we have convened a number of times additional extraordinary meetings with the chiefs of defense, either virtual or sometimes in person. For example, in the buildup of the forces the Russians were building up, we came together once physically to discuss the implications. And that in itself is a signal. If you convene all the chiefs of defense of the alliance, that is noticed by the media and therefore the Russians. And so sometimes that in itself is important to do to make sure that the Russians understand that we see what they do.
What is the relationship, both formal and informal, between you and Supreme Allied Commander, the working relationship? How does that work?
Again, it's not a given. I've had very good relationships with Todd Walters, the previous Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and with Chris Cavoli, the present Supreme Allied Commander. They're very different personalities, but I got along with both very well. There's 2 reasons for that. One, they are great people to work with. So I admire their leadership and the quality of what they bring. But they're also fun people to be with. And that's, in a way, also important. To be able to laugh with each other from time to time. Despite all the serious topics that we have, you have to be able to, at least I need that as well, to make fun a little bit of each other, of the situation, to continue then to work on it very seriously as well. But they're great leaders. And in different ways, they have been the right person in the right place for the alliance. It's a great pleasure to work with them. And I think what is important, again, I'm the highest military person in terms of the protocol, so to say, but I'm not the boss of the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. So I've never had sort of the attitude that I am their boss. I want to serve them as well, because the Supreme Allied Commander Europe is the highest operational commander. So he's the one that fights for us if it comes to it. So we need to make sure that he is in the best possible position to fight for us. And that means that the nations understand that they bring the right number of troops with the right quality, with the right kit, if the fight is there.
And that also means that your role is often closer by design to politics, in not a negative way, not partisan politics, but in terms of decisions about, say, industrial investment and where Europe is going on that, and military spending. Is that fair to say?
The funny thing is that, in a way, I have chosen to go that route. In a way, I chose to start to talk about the military production capacity, the whole of society approach. That was not something that is in my job description. The job description is actually very light. You're the chair of the military committee, period.
But you're not restricted from...
But I'm not restricted because I'm not having a boss, or I'm the boss of no one. So because it is based on making sure you add value, you're looking for things that are important, that need to be solved, and then I used my voice to raise those issues with the political level, but also with the military level. So I'm still trying to be on this political military line where you serve the military, but we need the political support for a number of changes and things that are necessary for the military to do their work.
Along those lines, I'd like to share some concerns, and listeners of the podcast will have heard them before. I'm extremely concerned that Europe has been much too lethargic, even in the context of this massive war happening in Ukraine, in investing in industrial capacity, investing in the growth of their armed forces and their defense budgets. And there are starting to be some promising initiatives beyond just the rhetoric. For example, the sea change in Germany. There was a lot of great rhetoric after Russia invaded Ukraine, but there was a real lag of output, orders, actual changes in spending. And it's been very concerning to me. And I'd just like to get your reactions to that and where you think the alliance is headed and member states are heading in terms of actually being a serious military bloc capable of both capability and capacity.
I share that concern. So we're not very far from each other there. I share that concern. That's why I started talking about it so much, because I think a lot of nations, it's one to say, yeah, we're going to produce a million grenades, but the only thing the Ukrainians are interested in is a million grenades, not about the promise. You can't fire promises at the Russians. So you need the hardware, you need the guns, you need the tanks. And I think for a while, there were a number of nations that talked a lot, but didn't walk the talk. I think that is changing. That has changed. There's a number of nations that have done an incredible job. If you look at the contribution per capita, or as a percentage of their GDP, they even do more than the US. If you look at some of the contributions, in absolute term, it is of course smaller. But if you look at the size of their economy, the size of their nation, they've done an incredible job. But again, it is time and time again, we're talking about 32 sovereign states with 32 governments, with 32 parliaments, with different populations, with different perceptions on what that war means for them in terms of immediate threat, on what it means if Ukraine loses that war. So I think at least I have continuously, together with the SecGen and I have been talking about the importance of that we cannot allow Russia to win this war, because there is much more at stake than Ukraine, much more. This is about the rules-based international order. This is about our way of life. This is about autocratic states versus democratic states. This is about accountability versus impunity. So that is sort of the higher goal and the thing we need to defend. And the same discussion happens in the US. After a while of supporting a nation like Ukraine in a war, you get a debate in a democracy like, hey, is this something we need to continue to do? Is it important enough? Do we have to talk to Ukraine and make sure that they stop the war? And so that discussion in itself is normal, I think, because we have an open society. We have people that are in favor and people that are against. But I think we cannot underestimate the danger of the Russians winning this war. But we are not an autocracy. So, I mean, we cannot force people to think in a particular way. We have to convince people. We have to convince investors and financial institutions to invest more in the defense industry. And if they don't, then we have a problem.
And you're a big advocate of this whole of society approach to reimagining how we defend our civilization. Could you talk about that?
I think for a long time, we have basically sort of outsourced external defense to the armed forces and internal defense to the police. And a lot of people say, don't bother me with it. You have the money. Stop talking to me. I'm not part of the solution. Well, actually, the people want more security. With the war closer and closer to home, people say, we need more security. That's why the politicians have agreed to the 2%, because they feel they need to do something. And then I say, it's not only about the money. It's not only about the 2%. Because it's also about the people. If you need new soldiers, because soldiers die and get wounded, we need to find new soldiers. And you cannot say it's the problem of the Minister of Defense and the Chief of Defense. It is the problem of us all. And you, dear ladies and gentlemen, are part of the solution. So we're talking about conscription. We're talking about mobilization. We're talking about reservists. We're talking about National Guard. I don't care what system you choose, but you're part of the solution. You cannot say this is a problem for the Minister of Defense or the Chief of Defense. It's our problem. And that's what we see in a war in Ukraine. It's same for the defense production. It's not enough for me that companies say, hey, I need a long-term demand signal and my shareholder value. And I say, hey, there's more than that. You are part of this system. You benefit from the rules-based international order. You benefit from the fact that you are able to work in a free society. So you have to choose sides as well. You have to become part of the values discussion. Private sector for 80 years didn't have to think about, is my factory there tomorrow morning? CEOs in Ukraine do. And because it was a given, the security was always there. Therefore, it's no longer part of the considerations. But they have to understand that it's in their strategic interest to invest in defense. And then we have discussions like, is it ethical to invest in defense industry? Is it against the sustainability goals? And I think, come on, guys, sustainability goals, if you have a war, you have a bigger problem with sustainability goals. Because then there's much more destruction. Go to Ukraine. 40% of the country's GDP was lost on the first day. If you look at the destruction, the money that is necessary to rebuild that country in all its aspects, the houses, the electricity grid, the water system, everything. If we can prevent that by the proper deterrence, by the right investments in our armed forces so that the Russians will think 10 times before they start a war, that is the best form of defense.
Yes, I think that's one of the problems with most ethical discussions about the relationship between the defense industry and ethics is that it has a narrow view of what ethics is.
I'm for peace, people say. Yeah, I'm for peace.
Preventing a war is the highest ethical, and you can't prevent a war in the real world without strength.
If you want peace, prepare for war.
I agree. Well, I understand you're working on a book possibly on the topic.
Yes, that's very exciting. With a close colleague that we are working on this topic for the last couple of years, and we're going to write this book. And we're talking to a publisher in the US, which is exciting because that allows us to publish the book in English, which has a larger audience, of course, than if you would publish it in Dutch. So that's one of the things we're looking at. There's no contract yet, but there's the good first discussions. And it talks about this. It is about, making sure that people understand the importance of the whole of society. The contribution is not just by the armed forces. It is by a society as a whole. The collective, the group, as we know in the military, the group is always more important than the individual. That's what you learn in the military. So how can we fight for the we in a world of me, where individualism has become the norm? That is sort of the idea of the book, to make sure that on the scale of me to we are too far on the me. Everything is about my happiness, my rights, my whatever.
And you don't just mean the person, you mean the company, the corporation.
It's also the private sector. Yeah. It is also The fact that we have stovepiped a lot of things in our society, where security and food and energy were different stovepipes, and people now start to understand that security goes through it as a cross-cutting theme, because Putin has used energy as a weapon, food as a weapon, migration as a weapon, and President Xi might use raw materials for the renewable energy as a weapon in the near future.
What's a book that you enjoyed very much lately?
There is a book, and it's been published maybe 10 years ago, 8 years ago, The Year Zero from Ian Burma. And it was about the first couple of years just after the Second World War. So people think about, okay, at the end of the war, everybody parties and is happy, and then we're living in peace. But the sheer size of destruction after the Second World War in Germany, in Japan, but in many other nations was such that it took many, many years before living in peace actually was fun again. You had the black markets that thrived because of shortage of basically everything. You had how to get rid of all the rubble of the destroyed German cities, of course, Nagasaki. So all the rebuilding of infrastructure. The people that came home from the concentration camps, the people that were doing labor in Germany or in Japan, that came home with terrible experiences. And then people in the country where they came home didn't understand what they had gone through. So that book is about hope. It is about how you rebuild after a terrible thing like war. And it is connected to the rules-based international order, because together we were believing we should never fight big competition again, big power competition again on the battlefield, but we should just have dialogue. And in case we cannot agree, go to the court. But might is right cannot be the next.
Well, nuclear terror played an important part in.
And then, of course, nuclear terror played a role there. But I mean, the nations that now say that it is a Western system were part of the design. I mean, Russia and China were part of the design as well. So it's too simple for them to say it's our system. Another
book that in the beginning tells a similar story that really grabbed me is Tony Jute's Post-War. I don't know if you read that, but the first couple chapters, it's a history, it's post-war Europe, but the first couple chapters talk a lot about just the mess of post-World War II Europe, and really vivid. And so I'll have to read that one too, but you definitely sold me on it.
Yeah, and another book I very much enjoyed is Christmas in Washington. And it's about Churchill as a prime minister. He goes to Washington in, I think, November 41. He goes to Washington. He leaves his country, which is at war. He takes with him a number of people, amongst them the chief of the Navy, the chief of the Air Force, fascinating, in a war. And then he goes on this warship to the U.S. and he stays in the White House for a number of weeks. And the reason for that trip is that he needs to convince President Roosevelt to join the war in Europe, because otherwise he's convinced the Europeans will not win the war against the Germans. And of course the Japanese. And then Pearl Harbor happened, and then in the end, basically Hitler was stupid enough to declare war at the US, which then solved that problem. But yeah, that's a fascinating book as well.
Well, thanks for making the time. Great conversation. Thanks for listening to this episode of the show. Don't forget to check out our membership program at warontherocks.com/membership. Stay safe and stay healthy.